That you might end up in hell is something that really triggers atheist YouTuber Stephen Woodford. And I don't know, maybe it triggers you too. The doctrine of hell is ludicrous nonsense, Stephen says, and therefore
mockery is quite frankly the kindest response at our disposal.
I don't mind being mocked, even less so when the mocking is ruled by so much irrationality that the strawman version of my beliefs gets attacked. Which is exactly what Rationality Rules has done. Join me for this video to see why Stephen and a great many atheists get hell completely upside down and find out why heaven may actually be the worst thing God could do to them. Let me give you a bit of context from the start. Cameron Bertuzzi from Capturing Christianity had William Lane Craig on his channel to critique a piece of comedy by George Carlin which focuses on hell. Stephen responded to their conversation claiming that Craig's points were invalid and that Carlin is right, as he went on to offer his own rationale for showing why the notion of hell is supposedly grotesque. That's why the right place for us to start is Carlin's clip. Here it is.
Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you.
Now, I'll let Stephen speak for himself as to why he thinks that Carlin is spot on with his comedy as he presents his case with great skill and clarity.
Carlin was mocking the divine judicial system due to its logical inconsistency. To hammer home his point, consider the following two criminals. Marcus Brutus, a Roman senator who along with his conspirators assassinated Julius Caesar, and Genghis Khan, a Mongolian warlord who was responsible for the death of up to 40 million people. In principle, at least, we can represent these crimes numerically. Brutus has, say, a criminal record of 1, and Khan has a criminal record of 40 million. You may disagree with this assignment, and if pushed, I probably would too, but I'm sure you get the point. Now, the scales of justice dictate that we issue a punishment that fits the crime, but here lies the contradiction of issuing an infinite punishment, hell, for a finite crime. 1 minus infinity is minus infinity. That is, by definition, infinitely disproportionate. That is not justice, and it certainly isn't mercy. It is, in fact, grotesquely immoral. The same is true, of course, of 40 million minus infinity. To quote Blaise Pascal, the finite is annihilated in the presence of the infinite and becomes a pure nothing. Or as the biochemist Isaac Asimov put it, infinite torture can only be punishment for infinite evil. And I don't believe that infinite evil can be said to exist, even in the case of Hitler. This was the critique that Carlin was expressing, and it is a very serious critique indeed. The rationale behind an infinite hell is ludicrous. I would in fact go further than Carlin and say that an omnipotent God that sanctions or permits an infinite punishment for a finite crime is the devil.
You know what? I agree with Stephen 100%. If God punishes people infinitely in hell for the finite amount of sins they committed during their 70 or so years on earth, then what God does is both immoral and illogical. But here lies the problem. Christianity simply doesn't teach that God punishes people infinitely for a finite amount of wrongs. Thus, the concept of hell that Stephen describes may well be ludicrous, but it sure as hell isn't a Christian concept. But before I move on to show what Christianity does actually teach about hell, let me first say that on the one hand, I don't blame Stephen for missing the target so much, because the distorted image of hell that he talks about is probably how most people think about it. On the other hand, I'd like to kindly challenge him for the next time to double check whether what he is criticizing is actually Christian theology itself, or rather his preconceived idea of what Christian theology is. I'm not being sarcastic here. This is meant as feedback with the best of intention. So here is where Stephen gets it wrong. Christianity doesn't teach that once people enter hell, they stop sinning. It teaches that people who enter hell never actually repent. They continue to reject God infinitely instead. There is no hint in the Bible that there is any repentance in hell, is how eminent New Testament theologian D.A. Carlin puts it. Now, if people persist in rebellion against God for all infinity, then infinite punishment is the logical outworking of that, as simple as that. This is why Craig, the very person whom Stephen criticizes for his views on hell, writes in another place, "Insofar as those who are separated from God continue to hate God and reject Him, they continue to sin and so accrue to themselves more guilt and more punishment. In a real sense, then, hell is self-perpetuating. In such a case, every sin has a finite punishment, but because sinning goes on forever, so does the punishment." In other words, yes, Christianity does teach that there is infinite punishment, yet not for a finite but rather for an infinite amount of transgressions. This point single-handedly debunks Stephen's critique, which seems to primarily target the non-existing discrepancy between hell as an infinite punishment for a finite crime. In other words, what Stephen has done is building and burning a straw man with the fires of his irrational annoyance against a dogma that has nothing to do with the Christian notion of hell. Now, of course, many skeptics say, sure, if I get to meet God on the day of judgment, I would start believing in Him, which is why they find it hard to accept the idea that anyone would continue in non-repentance for all eternity, as I just said. But not so quick. A couple of months ago, Matt Dillahunty ran a poll for his followers on the atheist experience with the question, would you worship a God if it were real? Where 85% of the approximately 20,000 participants said no. In other words, by their own admission, a great many atheists would still refuse to worship God even if they knew Him to be real. Thus, the 85% who voted no nicely confirm what the Bible teaches about hell, namely that the unrepentant who end up in hell stay unrepentant even after they face the reality of God's existence. That's why C.S. Lewis said that the doors of hell are locked on the inside, as its occupants remain rebels to the end. Now, what about the other 15%, those atheists and skeptics who would actually worship God once they were to know that He is real? How is hell fair for them? Great question, and we will get to this later. I first want to pick up another key point of Stephen's critique. Listen to what he says here as he interacts with Craig and the movie 300.
The mob boss of Christianity and Islam, God, has made us an offer we can't refuse. He says, look, listen, you can either accept my loving and gracious pardon,
and gracious pardon,
or I won't prevent bad things from happening to you. You see, you've been sentenced to hell, and it's entirely up to you.
It's entirely up to us
whether or not you accept my mercy.
Out of mercy,
it's not the lash they fear. It is my divine power. But I'm a generous God. I can make you rich beyond all measure.
Yes, yes, he continues, by virtue of me being omnibenevolent, I love you, and by virtue of me being omnipotent, I could save you from the hell that I've created. But I won't. Not until you get on your knees, pretend that I exist, and hallow my name. Unless you grovel, I will abandon you to a fate infinitely worse than any crime you could possibly commit.
Unless I misunderstand Stephen, his point seems to be the following. If you don't worship God, you end up in hell. However, there simply isn't enough evidence to believe in God, and so if you want to avoid hellfire, you have no other option other than pretending that God exists and worshipping Him. What's more, hell seems incompatible with the notion of both an all-loving God who, one would think, wouldn't wish for anyone to go to hell, and an all-powerful one who, one would also think, should be able to make this wish happen. There's a ton of things which Stephen gets upside down, unfortunately, so let's continue with clearing things up. Hell is basically a place or sphere for all who didn't want to have anything to do with God during their lifetime, and a place where God doesn't show His presence. Heaven is the opposite, that is, the place for those who've always wanted to love and pursue God, and the place where He is ultimately present. God leaves it up to us whether we want to love Him or not. He doesn't force us to. If He did, He wouldn't be loving, because no matter how much you love a person and desire for them to love you back, Ultimately, the most loving thing for you to do is to not impose yourself on them, but to let them decide if they actually want you in their life or not. Now, if heaven is the place for those who freely chose to love God, it is logically incoherent to suggest that even those who freely choose to not love God should make it there. This simply cannot be actualized, not even by God, and this has nothing to do with God's supposed lack of omnipotence, but it has everything to do with this being as self-contradictory and as nonsensical of an idea as the notion of a married bachelor. Or as C.S. Lewis once said, nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk it about God. But it's not only that it would be a self-contradiction for God to bring people into heaven who don't want to love Him. It would also be rather unloving for Him to do so, as it would essentially mean that He forces people into His presence even though that's exactly what they don't want. In contrast, the most loving thing God can do for those who don't want Him is to let them have what they want. No God in their life, to leave them alone, and that's exactly what hell is about. As we said, it's the place where God doesn't make His presence manifest. Thus, the dilemma that Stephen conjures up by trying to pitch God's omnipotence and omnibenevolence against hell really isn't a dilemma at all. The only reason Stephen thinks there is one is because he hasn't studied carefully enough what Christianity has to say about heaven and hell. Having said that, there is one thing which Stephen does get right, actually, which is that hell is an unpleasant place.
It's brilliant. Brilliant, Stephen.
It's unpleasant not because there's a literal fire burning, though that's yet another misconception Stephen perpetuates in his presentation. Instead, it's unpleasant because with the loss of God's presence comes the loss of goodness, beauty, and love, which have their ultimate origin in God. Yet, given that occupants of hell want nothing more than not having to deal with God, they prefer the misery that comes with His absence over the beauty and goodness that characterize heaven, where God is present. You could compare this to an alcoholic who wants nothing more than his bottle, so much so that he doesn't care when he ends up being left by his wife and kids who can't handle him anymore. Once they're gone, he's finally got what he always wanted, the chance to drink as much as he wants, without anyone bothering him. He is happy, or at least he thinks he is, and yet to the onlooker, it's clear that he has sunk as low as he possibly could. Similarly, those who end up in hell finally get what they always wanted, a God who isn't there and whom they would never want to worship. And while they think of themselves as happy and might even be happy in some twisted and messed up sense, their existence is one big tragedy, the opposite of what God originally intended for them, as they live on in a state that's deprived of everything that's good and beautiful. Now, I would like to assume that Stephen is not like those 85% who wouldn't want to worship God even if they knew He exists, and instead assume he's like the 15% who cannot genuinely worship God simply because they don't believe that He exists in the first place. The 15% who'd be happy to change if they became convinced of God's existence. This position is sometimes described as non-resistant skepticism. Understandably, the non-resistant skeptic finds it unfair that he or she should end up in hell for not believing in God, given that they feel that they couldn't believe in Him in the first place. At the same time, they feel, and rightly so, that kidding yourself and pretending to believe in God so that you can escape hell isn't exactly an intellectually honest position. This part of Stephen's criticism is, I admit, very important. Let me offer a couple of thoughts in return. If you are a non-resistant skeptic now and are genuinely open to changing your mind, there is no reason to throw out the possibility that you may actually undergo a change of mind in the future. I mean, no offense to Stephen, but I think it's safe to say that there have been people who were not only far brighter than he and I, but who were probably also more reluctant than we when it comes to believing in God. Anthony Flew, one of the 20th century's top atheist philosophers, ended up theist and stated that his discovery of the divine has been a pilgrimage of reason and not of faith. whereas C.S. Lewis became a Christian after years of thinking through and wrestling with a whole range of philosophical, historical, and scientific issues pertaining to the faith. So if these guys change their minds, surely change of mind is in the realm of the possible for Rationality Rules. All the more so as his fellow atheist Thomas Nagel, who is an accomplished philosopher, admits that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. Now, I'm not prophesying that we're about to witness the conversion of Stephen Woodford. My point is a very different one. Stephen reacts very strongly against the concept of hell, calling it grotesquely immoral and the God who's behind it, the devil. Furthermore, Stephen, you take issue with the Christian God for throwing people into hell because he hasn't provided enough evidence for you to believe in him. Yet, at the same time, you've clearly missed what Christianity actually teaches about hell. And the hell you reject is one which Christianity rejects too. In other words, it's rather ironic that a substantial part of your criticism of hell emerges from your conviction that God hasn't provided enough data for you to believe in him, while you haven't even dealt with the actual data of what Christianity teaches about hell. Thus, it is at least possible that the real problem may not lay with the Christian concept of hell itself, but simply with the distorted caricature that you've painted.
When those that preach this nonsense presume to lecture us on morality, mockery is quite frankly the kindest response at our disposal.
Now, you can call God the devil as much as you want and mock as long as you want those by whom you don't want to be lectured on morality, because they believe in this hell nonsense. But the problem is that the nonsensical hell you're talking about simply isn't taught by Christianity, and so it may just be, with all due respect, that the one and only thing that's so grotesquely illogical is not hell itself, but your critique of what such a terribly distorted version of it that even the term straw man falls short. As I said before, I don't mind being mocked, but for Stephen's sake, whom I assume to be genuinely open to real dialogue, I'd like to kindly encourage him to tackle the real thing whenever he engages his opponent, no matter whether it's Cameron Bertuzzi, William Lane Craig, or some other Christian or even non-Christian thinker. Having said that, when it comes to heaven and hell in particular, the stakes are literally infinitely high, which is why missing the actual argument is infinitely more unfortunate in this case. Given that Stephen has definitely caught the infinity aspect of hell, this may well be the one thing he and I agree on. Now, in case you think that the topic of hell is the only instance where Stephen builds a case by essentially discarding the data, you're mistaken. Over here, I show how his case against free will blatantly omits crucial evidence of the very studies he cites in support of determinism. Check it out, and thank you for watching.